Hi, welcome back after I've got a chance to have a coffee. My name is Selina and I'm delighted to be here with you all this morning. I've had the pleasure and the honour of participating in the project from the first conference. So it's wonderful 4 years later to be back and to see some familiar faces. Our session this morning is on fertility and contraception. And before I hand over to my fellow panel members, just tell you a little bit about myself. I've been a disabled activist for, oh God, well over 25, 30 years, too long to count. But I'm part of the independent living movement and benefited greatly from being part of that movement, being part of such a wonderful movement of people in solidarity and being able to help affect change in Ireland. My day job is as an access equality officer with a local authority, but my passion really is reproductive justice for disabled persons. And part of that, a big part of that is based on my own lived experience of the 15 years of navigating assisted human fertility with my husband in order to get the right to actually have get the help to have a child and to fight the prejudice that exists within the system. So that's how I've kind of ended up here with this project. So really enough about myself. I'd much rather give you the time to hear from the wonderful people here at the table with me. And the first person that we have is Emma Burns. Emma's part of the team. Sorry, no, I'm wrong. I apologize. First person we have will be Áine Sperrin. Áine was part of the team over the last number of years, and her responsibility was to conduct legal and policy research and the qualitative research for professionals for the Reproductive Justice Project. I'm going to let Áine introduce herself in more detail in a moment. But just to let you know, we're also joined by Orla and Bren O'Reilly to my left, who will be sharing their lived experience as disabled advocates and change makers, fellow change makers. And then we will also be joined by Maulani Rotinsulu, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. You're very welcome, Maulani. Had a very long journey yesterday to get to us from Indonesia, so it's wonderful to have her here today, and I will let her introduce herself in more detail later on in the session as well. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Áine.
Brilliant, thanks very much. It's lovely to be back. Like Selina said, I was a member of the Reproductive Justice team up until September last year, and I did the qualitative research with the professionals, as well as doing the legal and policy analysis. I'm currently with an organisation called Trilateral Research, where I'm a senior research analyst working on human rights and climate change, environment and energy. And there's a lot of crossover there's a lot more recognition now that reproductive justice is really central to kind of realising climate justice at an individual level, at community level, and more internationally as well. So it's great to be able to make the linkages between my two hats that I kind of wear simultaneously. So we know from multiple international human rights instruments that a right to fertility and contraception services is promoted under the right to health, under reproductive health rights, a right to privacy, and being able to choose the number and spacing of your children. Ireland's legislative and policy framework around fertility and contraception, unfortunately, hasn't been so progressive, and like all of the topics to be discussed today, has been influenced by church and a lot of conservative factors. So as a result, disabled people experience discrimination on multiple fronts, and in the project we found these to be kind of reinforcing or cyclical. So I'll talk through some of them now. So firstly, we found ableist attitudes of hypersexuality has led to sterilisation and long-acting contraception being administered sometimes without the knowledge or the consent of the individual. Other attitudes then that disabled people are asexual and would have no need for fertility or contraceptive services at all has meant that there's been no broaching of the topic with them. Or there's also the belief that Disabled people would not be capable of parenting, but might still be exposed to sexual behaviour, whether that's through a consensual relationship or through assault. And all of this has impacted how particularly adults with intellectual disabilities have been subjected to contraception and sterilisation procedures. Disabled people also have to contend with attitudes that procreation is a function that they don't have autonomy over, and we've had reported denials of services either to promote or to reduce someone's fertility based on the origin of their disability, and always contrary to the will and preference of the individual. And we find that this ableism is embedded across all of the barriers, so it's really the foundation. Then, due to perceptions about being unsuited to parenthood or not being recognised as having a sexual identity, sex education has been denied to many disabled people. One cause of this has been the segregated and religious ethos of many educational facilities for disabled people. And for those residing in residential settings or who might be reliant on day services for information as adults, they're also subject to biases and the comfort level of staff members in discussing sex and relationships. Where we did see examples of sex education, it does tend to be kind of focused on straight couples and very much biology focused, rather than reflecting the wide variety of sexuality and relationships and all the different ways to have a family. We found that physical or informational access to fertility and contraception, it would be the next big barrier, whether it's the physical location of services, often in older buildings and connected with health services. Accessibility within even the newest buildings, the lack of knowledge among practitioners about very simple accommodations or the appropriateness of recommended interventions, all service barriers, which could be very easily addressed with kind of increased resources and practical approaches and thinking outside of the box attitudes. Attitudes then is another big barrier. So the interpersonal kind of exchanges during procedures, whether it's making appointments or receiving services, changes in kind of a person's attitudes are needed to eliminate the inappropriate inclusion of family members or support staff in fertility decision-making. We've seen that more disability awareness across production lines in the healthcare sector is needed to address the lack of universal design of contraceptive devices, as well as addressing the limited availability of relevant information in accessible formats. Even if disabled people can identify appropriate fertility and contraceptive services, cost can be the next big problem. It's well documented that disabled people in Ireland disproportionately experience poverty, and this can impact on their choices. This is particularly relevant when disabled people are seeking assisted human reproduction services, and this remains largely unregulated and very much in the hands of private service providers. And we've seen laws and policies and attitudes that are potentially discriminatory on the basis of disability. And the project was really pleased to work alongside Selina and other kind of coalition members to kind of promote a more disability equality approach to recent surrogacy legislation and highlighting discrimination in health screening services like cervical check and breast check. We know that there's been recent changes enabling free contraception to young people, and this is very welcome and it should be extended as much as possible, but it should also be monitored to make sure that there's no ableism creeping in there. We know disabled people are disproportionately subject to biases and coercion from other people in what's usually a very private area of all of our lives, and this has a big impact on them realising their choices. So being exposed to beliefs and messaging that parenting and relationships isn't for disabled people, being threatened with legal action or criminal action for pursuing a relationship, or coercion from professionals or family members about using a particular form of contraception or undergoing sterilisation has also been reported. Further, there is a lack of full consideration of the impact of other health treatments, which don't consider long-term impacts on fertility, particularly in the mental health field. To move to more kind of positive facilitators now, where we have seen support being provided for people to access fertility and contraception services. It's come in the shape of, networks of family members, of friends, peers, some professionals. And disabled people have been empowered to challenge biases and prejudices, to literally access information, or to physically attend appointments, or to advocate for their needs within an appointment. Along with personal support, adaptations to information and the delivery of services have eliminated many barriers. This includes taking up telemedicine, especially after COVID. That's one kind of positive, that health services are adjusting how they deliver their services. It can be adjusting physical spaces, meeting people on the ground floor of a facility, and staff taking flexible approaches to delivering their services. We've also seen some good examples of training for staff members and family members, and for disabled people themselves around relationships and sexuality, such as the CREA service connected with John of God's. But we're seeing this very much on a one-off or isolated basis rather than consistent. We all know that whether you have a good or a bad encounter with health, legal or social work professionals, it can leave a lasting memory, but positive encounters do resonate and can be achieved quite easily. So we've seen positive interactions very much at an individual level based on what we've heard in the project, and there's a need to expand this attitude and to resource services appropriately, so that it doesn't depend on what part of the country you're in or what individual staff member you encounter. So to summarise the key findings, overall, there needs to be a lot of disability awareness training for professionals engaging in fertility and contraception services. Any legal regulatory frameworks now or in the future relating to contraception and fertility, particularly around assisted human reproduction, must not have discriminatory elements, whether in the text of the law or in practice, and it must be monitored to make sure that ableism isn't there in practice. And putting in place adequate and appropriate sex education, which meets the needs of disabled people and recognises diversity across sexuality, is essential for future generations to avoid the gaps currently facing the adult population. And it was mentioned before, but the Assisted Decision Making Capacity Act 2015 can go a long way to address coercive practices, especially if staff and family members are aware of the ethos and apply it appropriately and support kind of promoting will and preferences of the individual rather than best interest. So I know a lot of these there be crossover with some of the other topics that we hear, but I'm looking forward to hearing what my co-panelists have to say as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Áine. And before I welcome Orla and Bren, something just Áine mentioned there reminds me of this is a very timely time to be coming to a conclusion with this part of the work and launching the research and launching the toolkits, because we're at a very interesting time in the area of reproductive justice in Ireland. And we've got the Assisted Human Reproduction Bill that hopefully will be with us very, very soon. And there's also within that the international surrogacy piece. And as Áine mentioned, you know, been involved in that to ensure or try to ensure that the rights of disabled persons are met and recognised within this new legislation. And as part of that, there's a plan for 6 regional fertility hubs around the country, and there's also now funding for persons to apply into for funding to access IVF services. So it's a very important time to be vigilant to ensure that those new facilities are equality proofed. And I would certainly be very interested if anybody does engage with any of them, they have any feedback or questions. My email is in the bio, and I'd love to hear from you so that we can really try to make the work that's happened over the last 4 years really live and affect the positive change that I really believe, and I think we all believe it can actually do. So now I'd love to introduce you to Orla and Bren O'Reilly. I had the pleasure of meeting them for the first time last night, and it was really, really, really lovely. So thank you for that. They're powerful self-advocates for the rights of persons with
with additional support needs. Would that be correct way of?
Yeah.
I think that's how you introduce yourself. And they live in a wonderful part of Dublin, in Baldoyle, so very lucky to be very near the sea. And I'm going to hand over, and I know that Emma from the project is going to kind of facilitate their contribution this morning.
Thanks, Selina. So I'm Emma Burns. I'm researcher on the project since October, and I'm just going to facilitate this conversation with Orla and Bren. Orla and Bren are very well established self-advocates and expert public speakers. They're engaged with Trinity College Dublin and regularly do public engagements promoting rights, and they were involved as well in the campaign for the right to relationships themselves, and also a lot of advocacy work around independent living. So yeah, they're very much the experts on this topic. And as Selina said, I thought it was a wonderful phrase there, the change makers. But we're going to start with focus on relationships and your own experiences of that. So Bren, I think you were going to start. I'll start you off with a question. So just tell us, first of all, a little bit about how you met and how long you've been together and how your relationship kind of progressed.
Hello, I'm Brendan. I met Orla at the art station. It's a very strange story. But my sister Bridgie, who's also an obviously speaker, she's living independently. She's Orla's best friend. Yeah. So we were helping her to move from. She was moving into Fhlatharta. Well, she was moving from Fhlatharta to Portmarnock, wasn't it? Or was it the other way around? All right, the other way around. Yeah, and we went and helped her to move in because she was living in respite, like she was living in St. Michael's for a long time, and her husband she wanted to be independent as possible, so she wanted to get her own house and to prove people that she can live independently. So me and Orla we were start chatting. Do you want to say something as well?
We're together 18 years, but married 8 years and 10 years before we got married. As Bren said, we met at the art station, and I challenged him to a game on the PlayStation. So
So you didn't stay fighting though. That was a fighting game, I think. No. So when did you get married?
2015. It would be 8 years married this year.
And did you have a lot of support around your relationship, like from your family, friends, and supporters?
We had mostly my mum, but we did have a social worker which I'm not going to name, but she was really good. Mostly my family, and Brendan's sister was the one that supported both was true.
So, Bren, tell us a little bit about when you were getting married. I think you told me last night you wanted to get married in 2012.
Yeah, we were planning to get married in 2012, but we hadn't got the money, so we pushed it back for 2015. And on that same day, I was picked to play for Ireland for the Special Olympics for a football tournament. But you always have to choose something. So, anyway, yeah. Well, I think I chose right. I think I chose the right one. But anyway, we as I say, we got married in 2015, the 3rd of July. We invited, was it 100 people? Yeah, we invited 100 people, and we were surprised that actually the 100 people that we invited showed up. Yeah. Because we were thinking about, because friends that we have would be in like wheelchairs, and we wanted to make sure that would be access for everyone. And the Orla's mom and her brother, well, because I come from a family with disability, like all my family have disability bar one, and my mom was sort of supportive, but Orla's mom didn't understand it for a while because she was worried about Orla, because when I'm in Orla and Mum been with her, but God knows how long, and like they lived there, like always, like they're like teenagers, they go shopping a lot, and so I think Orla's mum was afraid to let Orla move out independently because she was afraid of what way her would go with her ability. But I mean, I can't say with Orla's ability, she has limited abilities. She's loads of abilities that she can do. But anyway, we went to the Grand Hotel and we had a great night. Our song for our wedding was Angels from Robbie Williams, and I sang the Angel song in front of all of our family, and I'm surprised they liked me singing. Yeah, but after that, we were living in, was it Northern Cross? Someone said.
We lived in Northern Cross for 8 years, but unfortunately we had to move because the landlord was horrible. So we then moved to Baldoyle and we're there ever since, which is 7 years, 8 years this year.
Okay, so we're going to get into another more personal question this time. So you told me that after you got married, you made the decision not to use contraception and that you were open to maybe having children. But you weren't 100% sure about it, but just see what happens. That's fair. Okay. Can you tell me a little bit about the reaction of family or staff when you decided, when you told them that you were open to starting your family?
As I said, well, a social worker, but as soon as we mentioned the kids, they were like, we have to see about this. We're not allowed to have, so.
Bren, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, we were talking to a social worker, and the social worker knows my family for a long time, and I think she says to me that when we mentioned the kids, they put us to a bunny course. I mean, you know what a bunny course is? But a bunny course is a doll that you get. It's a doll that the doll cries, and we had to feed it like a real baby and whatever. And the social worker got involved saying, because when I said that I want to have kids, she says, well, I don't know if that's going to happen. And then when she said that, I just was not interested in having kids anymore, because she kind of pushed us off it. But you got a cat. I mean, that's good enough. I mean, yeah. But yeah, but and then I know a lot of people with export needs want if they ask for compensation, they look at them saying, well, what was the compensation for? Well, obviously we're human, so like we want to have protection if that happens, or you don't want your girlfriend pregnant or something. But they never tell you about, you can say anything about areas about sex education or nothing. Like we were just going in as people, and they don't even tell you about the problems you can get with like intercourse, like sex transmitted diseases and stuff like that. They never gave us the information. My family, I think, told me all the information because I had like 14 in my family, and I got the information from them and friends. So the social work didn't really help me with compensation, which I think they should make it easier for people with expert needs with compensation, like easy reading, and not to be ashamed as a person with expert needs asks for information on composition. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So basically you were supported to have a relationship, not given any sex education, not allowed any contraception, and told not to have children. Okay, it's a pretty good summary, I think, of support that they got. Okay, we've only got 1 minute left, so thinking about, your own futures, what do you think you see in the future for yourselves?
As much as having kids is lovely, we have discussed that we wouldn't be able to travel, like we wouldn't be able to go. Well, we've been to Orlando, Portugal, Spain, and we're going to Malta in July for 10 days. So
you're having a pretty full life, yeah.
My part of what I want to see in the future for people with export needs, I use the word export needs because special needs is something that I don't like, because we're not special people. We just need export needs. So my part is to change the word for export needs, as we did with Love is Love, which we done. And like everyone's entitled to love, but I want to see people with export needs not be ashamed to have a family, and not social workers say, well, you can't have kids because I don't think your ability to be able to have it, and listen to it. When I was listening to one earlier on, it really opens up that anything is possible if you're a person with export needs, or anyone's entitled to have a family, still want to have a family, and you're entitled to say no if you don't want to have a family, and you're entitled to say no if you want to have the child. So it should be, I just want the equal for everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bren and Orla, and thank you, Emma, for facilitating. I think it's so powerful what particularly Bren was saying there about love is love, and your explanation of the difference between kind of special needs and extra support needs. And so I think it's really wonderful that you are both part of the 20 speakers, and that you have the power to actually affect change by affecting attitudes and changing attitudes. So that's just wonderful, and it's really good to know that there are people like yourself actually within the education system making change. So thank you for that. And it's my pleasure. Our final speaker before we go to the Q&A is our international, going to provide our international response, and it's welcome Maulani. Maulani is a self-advocate and a disability activist for more than 35 years. So another veteran warrior, which is wonderful to have so many in the room like that. The power that's in this room to affect change in this world, positive change, is just amazing to see and feel. And I'm going to let Maulani give you more of an introduction to herself, because my goodness, you've been involved in so much and you've achieved so much that I think I don't want to sell you short. But I think it's much important if you introduce yourself. Microphone.
Thank you. Okay. So, good day, everyone. I'm Maulani Rotinsulu from Indonesia. Now I'm working for the ASEAN or Southeast Asia Disability Forum, managing the work that mostly advocating, assessment, and reviewing the policy. We've been succeed in creating ASEAN Enabling Master Plan 2025, mainstreaming the rights of persons with disabilities. In my own country, Indonesia, I'm a co-founder of Indonesian Associations of Women with Disability, where most of the works is also advocacy, supported by Disability Rights Fund, thanks. And also, I have been in disability movement since I'm in a high school. So, and thank you for inviting me for this very important conference. So responding on what Orla and Bren O'Reilly experienced, I would like to share about a situation of women with disability in Indonesia and other 9 countries in Southeast Asia relating to the fertility and contraceptions. Colleagues, throughout their lives, women and children with disabilities would face the potential of different types of discrimination and marginalizations to their gender and disability, of course. Their access to many aspects of life, such as health services, education, employment, has been systematically restricted due to the multiple discriminations, not only because of their gender, but also because of their disability. The intersectionality of disability with age, race, ethnicity, sex, gender, religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and other identity can multiply the type of degree of the stigma, discrimination, and disadvantage that girls and women with disabilities experience. So violence against women and girls happen to girls and women with disability in Indonesia within a whole cycle of their lives. The review of Indonesia by CRPD committee they said that the lack of the inclusion of a gender perspective in disability-related legislation and policy, as well as the lack of disability perspective in gender-related legislation and policy, which led the further exclusion, inequality, and discrimination of women and girls with disability. So, relating to the fertility in reproductive lives, reproductive health lives, for example, in Indonesia, menstrual hygiene has still been a taboo area to be discussed in many rural areas. And sadly, girls and women with disability often did not have access to sufficient information about menstrual hygiene and affordable menstrual pads, which are part of their sexual reproductive health rights. There are around 5,000 women out of 11.3 million women with disability throughout Indonesia who live in institutions with public facilities and severely experience gaps in accessing information and fulfilling their rights relevant to their reproductive health. It can be said that the overall access to the overall reproductive health needs and hygiene menstrual support among them, mainly women with psychosocial disabilities living in institutions, are very, very limited. Allow me to share two cases that I've been involved in. First is the government regulation on reproductive health seems very complete to protect and talk about the right of sexuality, reproduction health in global principle. However, it doesn't talk about women and teenagers or girls with disability. Why I mention this? Because it impacted to the implementation strategy of the government itself. There will be no budget allocation for women and girls with disability relating to the services, insurance, and availability of reasonable accommodation because of no sentence of disability inside of these regulations. So second case, at the period of ratification and domestication of CRPD in Indonesia 2016, the law of persons with disabilities mentioned women with disability have following rights: for reproductive health, to accept and refuse the use of contraception, to receive extra protection from multiple discrimination, and to receive extra protection from any acts of violence, including sexual violence and exploitation. But again, what happened in 2017 to 2020, we have to fight for the Bill of Sexual Violence Crime that said intellectual and mental disability victims of sexual violence crime in the level of decision-making on their fertility, contraception, and sterilization is that at the hand or will or decision of family and expert without consent. So it happened due to the lack of knowledge within women movement activists and parliament who initially draft the bill on how to describe equal rights of women and girls with disability. But thanks God, at the beginning of 2020, the bill had been established with the appropriate manner and principle on the protection of women and girls with disability. So from these two aspects, I would like to address from these two cases based on our advocacy experience are, first, we have to strive the regulation along with the educating stakeholders, decision makers, parliament, people who have obligation to work in this field to understand on how and what CRPD said clearly, offer society knowledge and cultural norm or beliefs. And the second is people with disability should engage, participate meaningfully in all process of educating, giving knowledge on how we interact directly or indirectly to people above, who have to go there to tell on what should they do for equality and equity. There is no exception for person with disability, but accommodation of their voice and way of life. Our participation is not a jargon. Eyewitnesses on how things going on different or wrong perspectives when persons with disability are not there to show the way how they engage. So improving knowledge, skill, understanding, access to reproductive health service, and better availability of information on issue of persons with disabilities, such as different needs of various types of disability related to the sexual reproductive health, including violence, the needs of health, psychological and paralegal service providers, the needs of parents, guardians, companions, nurses, significant others, and carers of children with disability. This is important for the provision of services support that can effectively respond to the important issue of persons with disabilities and their family. I thank you.
Thank you, Maulani, for such an interesting contribution from an international perspective. And it's really interesting to see similarities and comparisons between kind of Ireland and Indonesia. And a couple of things that came to mind for me was in Ireland, we have the National Strategy for Women and Girls. And I think it's really telling that the, well, kind of a core aim that women and girls will achieve equality with men and boys. And I often think, well, surely we need to achieve equality with, you know, the disabled women need to achieve equality with non-disabled women and girls, but we can aspire to kind of greater heights of equality. So, you were talking about kind of menstrual management and period like that. And in Ireland, we have kind of a lot of work kind of where the public agencies are providing period products in public toilets. And I know in my day job, I was kind of saying to my employer, well, we need to make sure we're putting them into the accessible toilets as well. It's not just the general toilets that need to, well, obviously we were pointing out they need to be put into gents toilets as well as the ladies, you know, to have full equality. But so it's interesting to see how some issues, they're universal. It's not just a problem within one country. I'm going to open out the floor now and our Zoom to questions and answers. If anyone who's on Zoom, you can put your question into the Q&A, and then anyone who's here in the room, if you could just say your name and where you're from, that would be wonderful as well, or indicate in advance. I'll just wait for the microphone to come to you.
Hi, I'm Florencia. I'm from Chile. I'm a researcher. I'm a sociologist. Well, it's really amazing to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm conducting qualitative research. I'm not going to read that because I don't know if it's going to understand my accent. I'm doing qualitative research right now on this topics about disability and reproduction. It's also really amazing and surprising is the similarities. You know, you can cross the continents and oceans, and we find realities that are really, really similar. So I wanted to ask to the researchers about some, I don't know if I can call it problems. You know, I'm a mother with a visual disability, and I think some thing I have encountered in my research is that disabled people are like socialized to be disabled. You know, it's like from they are very little, they're like, don't worry, you're not going to have kids, you're not going to be sexual, you're going to be an infant forever. And so, well, what we call like this internal ableism that you can find in the report you gave to us also, no? So in the interviews, it can be hard for people to be aware of disableism and to be aware of their rights. For example, I interview a deaf mom who was also a wheelchair user, and I asked her through the interpreter if she had been discriminated no, and she said no. And I asked her about her the birth of her son, and she said it was great. And then I asked her if she had any accommodations, for example, in the I don't know how to say the word in English, this kind of bed you lay when you are in labor or when you have a gynecologic exam. You know, if there was like any accommodations. Well, no, there wasn't. And when I go to the gynecologist, they just use a normal chair. It's like, I don't know how you can do that. And was there an interpreter? No, there wasn't. They talked with my mom, and usually I didn't understand what was happening, you know, but her expectations were so low that if she, I don't know, nobody yelled at her or insulted her like directly. Nobody hit her, but they were really, really fine. You know, they were so nice to me. So my question, sorry, is in the interviews, how or in the field work, how can you think you can manage this kind of thing when people are to talk about discrimination and ableism when sometimes, or is it maybe is it different here? People are not aware of the ableism that surround them, or the discrimination, stigmatization, etc. Yeah, I think that would be well for you. Want to take a couple first? Oh, okay, sure.
Hi, I'm Theresia from Germany. Thank you so much, Ben and Orla, for sharing this story. I'm a professor at the School of Social Work, and I'm also training social workers. So my question goes to you. What do you want from social workers to help you in terms of your marriage? Do you want your social worker to talk about sex with you? Do you want your social worker to talk about contraceptions with you and other things? Or would you rather have someone else do that, or just read by yourself? What would you like? What would you tell? How would you answer this question? I hope I made it clear.
We were doing a course in the training centre that R&I are in. They were talking about sex education, and they were telling us bits and pieces about it. But because there's so many, like not the social workers, but because there's so many parents that have peoples that have a disability, I think, well, export needs, sorry. I think they're afraid if they tell the person with export needs about sex education that to be vulnerable to them. So I think they do that to save their own son. So to me, if I wanted to learn about sex education, I would ask a social worker, like just for research, but I'd like to research the rest of myself, because at the end of the day, like we're human, so we need to research stuff ourselves. Like we're not always going to have social workers around. Like the way our and I's relationship is that if we have a problem, then we can solve it in relationship or sex education, we will say it. So I just want the social worker to be a good listener, to understand it. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah, no problem.
Okay, thanks, Bren. Áine, do you want to give a quick response, then we go to next question?
So mostly I can speak from doing the qualitative research with the professionals, and it was really important, even before the interview had started, to make clear, you know, we have this UNCRPD ethos, we're coming from the rights of the disabled person, and that helped to kind of let the professional know where I was coming from. We often, people would be really concerned about using the right language. They wouldn't want to offend, and they'd say, please correct me. And I'd be like, okay, you know, we're all learning, you know, you don't know what you don't know sometimes when you're dealing with the professionals. but just really setting those expectations about, like, I'm not going to tolerate really bad language or derogatory things, or if you like explain something that is a part of your practice that is very discriminatory. I don't have a good poker face, whether I'm sitting in front of you or I'm online. Though I try to, stay professional, but people would know, like, okay, that's really something we need to, she didn't respond well to that. And then I kind of take that as a prompt to be like, well, if you were looking at UNCRPD or from our other research, what we are seeing is, here's an example of a reasonable accommodation that you could make. I think in terms of the internalized ableism, and Jenny might be able to speak to this because she did the interviews with the people with lived experience. But if somebody were to describe, my experience was okay, it's not our job to come and traumatize them then and be like, here's all of the ways that your experience was terrible, if actually they've come through it and they've processed it themselves. But usually talking to people, you can kind of draw out like, well, could that have been done better? Or if you were to go maybe for round 2, and that's something that we've asked a lot of our participants, what advice would you give to yourself or to someone else starting out on your journey? So people might think about it in that way of, next time round, now that I know I can have a PA or an interpreter in the room, or I actually wasn't comfortable with my parent or sibling being involved in those discussions. So yeah, but again, setting from the outset, kind of what the ethos of the project is and what our understanding of disability rights is, and that we're promoting full independence as much as possible. That was really, really helpful, and maybe Jenny will be able to talk later as well about her experiences.
Okay, thank you, Áine. We can take one more question, and then we're going to have to bring this session to a close. I've been asked to bring it to a close because we are running a bit over time. So we've got one more. Oh, you got the microphone.
To ask a question. I'm
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Alana from the National Women's Council, and we do a lot of work on the contraception scheme because we also sit on the Women's Health Task Force. And one of the, I suppose, accessibility considerations which we've been advocating for, aside from telemedicine, is pharmacist prescribing, so that people who need contraception could be able to attend their pharmacist, do the consultation and the checks there, and particularly, I suppose, in the context of secondary prescriptions, where it works for you and there hasn't been any problems. But I was wondering kind of what the panel thought about that, and then also if there were any other ideas apart from telemedicine or pharmacist prescribing which could be helpful in addition to the training and the universal design.
Would you like to answer that?
Yeah, I had an incident when I went to a pharmacy asking for contraception, and they looked at me and they didn't really give me much information. So for me, I would it's someone that it's a familiar with a person with extra support needs that has would be there to supervise somebody to talk about it, because like even when we go to like everyone's like doctors is black and white when they're talking about you saying, yeah, well, there's a problem with this, there's a problem with that. But if we had like a social worker or your support worker that would come along with you and just make it easier access, like to understand it a little bit more, because some pharmacies they talk too fast about it, and then you're going out and you forget what they said about it. Yeah, that's just what that's what I'd like to do. Yeah.
Thanks, Bren. And just before we go, just say to the relation as well, I think what's really important is that there's more information provided about how different forms of contraception interact and are usable by people with different abilities and maybe medical needs. There was a wonderful chart done many years ago in a book called The Baby Challenge, and that never really seems to have been updated. So that's definitely something that would be very, very helpful, because you can't expect pharmacists to be fully knowledgeable if they don't have the information and the training. So that would be just a further recommendation in relation to that. And on that note, I'm going to thank you all for your participation and your time for this session. And I'm going to, with great relief, hand over to the next session and just get a chance to enjoy the rest of the day. So thank you very much.
Hello? No, I knew I would screw this up. Can everybody hear me through the mic? Okay. My name is Mairéad Enright. I'm a professor of law at the University of Birmingham. I've done bits and bobs on reproductive rights in Ireland. I'm very pleased to be here. My only job is to chair. That's all I have to do. So my first job is to introduce Maria Níl, who works on the Reproductive Justice Project, and she's going to present the findings from the project on the topic of abortion.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today, and sort of particularly after listening to some of the contributions this morning, thinking, 4 more years wouldn't be the worst thing in terms of looking at the depth of this topic. Abortion is intrinsically linked to all of the other areas that we're talking about today, but also somewhat stands alone. This project operated alongside a really significant legal change, which is to say that as I hurriedly submitted an application to work on the project as we were going through the last of the legislative debates following the 2018 referendum. And I think I can describe the mood at that point as just very, very tired. And as the team started, we were in this sort of new world where abortions were actually being carried out under the Health Termination of Pregnancies Act. And we've been at this kind of interface between a world where abortion could never be discussed in terms of rights to where we now had this new law. And the law, for those who are joining us internationally, broadly speaking, allows for abortion on the basis of specific grounds on request to 12 weeks, although throughout the project, it's been incredibly clear that accessing it after 9 is actually quite difficult, in danger to health or life, in cases of fatal fetal anomaly and emergencies. And I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes talking about some of the issues and barriers and some of the facilitators that people have in terms of abortion that have become clear during the project. But something I want to mention from the outset, and I reread it again this morning, was the experience of one of our incredible oral history participants who described accessing abortion prior to 2019, to accessing abortion through pills that she had imported illegally, and the fear that she had, and her description that she would be perfectly happy to march in and not so much ask for, but demand to be to get an abortion under this new thing. And while we'll talk about all of the reasons why that may not work out, this is the fact the legal change we've had is the removal of a really significant barrier. Disability and abortion. I really quite like ASEAN when they say, both movements, the reproductive rights and reproductive justice movement and the disability rights and disability justice movement, which is 4 movements. Both movements strive for bodily autonomy, the right of each person to make their own healthcare decisions, and share an understanding that these are all deeply connected to dignity and equality. And we already spoke about this morning how this is often rarely discussed within the broader reproductive justice movement or the broader reproductive rights movement, and even within the broader disability movement. But as a lot of the people here know, at the intersection between those movements, that where we sit together, particularly for disabled people who are reproductive rights activists, these are conversations that happen naturally and organically and comfortably. We can even see within the Disability Rights Convention, the UNCRPD, you have this right to choose and the number and spacing of your children, which is an incredibly powerful statement of reproductive autonomy. Yet this is always seen as taboo and not something that can ever really be talked about because of the constant focus on the idea of a disabled fetus rather than the disabled person as an actor, as a pregnant person. So one of the things that's very clear is that a lot of the time when we're talking about accessing abortion under the new termination of pregnancy legislation, is that we're looking at deliberate barriers. And inaccessibility often operates on two fronts, right? There's the inaccessibility because of a lack of foresight or a lack of thought of non-disabled people. So people build physical infrastructure that's not accessible because they, physical infrastructure that they assume that isn't accessible because they never imagine a disabled person using it, or specific measures which are set out to control the disabled population, such as capacity laws, which are specifically targeted. Abortion law kind of sits in between those two spaces. If you read the Act, it really does look like they never really imagined a disabled person accessing a termination under the Act. But also alongside it, there's deliberate measures which are specifically to target pregnant people who or control people who they've deemed not worthy or of accessing a termination or of accessing abortion, and the people who don't fit within this very particular idea. And disabled people are very much multiply punished or by this and suffer to a greater extent by these barriers that are put in place so that it's only the good women, and they only ever talk about women, who access abortions. And I think we can see these barriers really clearly with the 3-day wait, which appeared out of nowhere in order to ease the discomfort of some particular politicians who were principally opposed to abortion. And this 3-day wait was put as a way to sort of possibly prevent lots of people from having, the term a friend's granny used was willy-nilly abortions, and I really liked that. And it's there and it impacts all pregnant people, but for disabled people, the burden is so much more significant, particularly when you think about if you have to organise PAs, if you have to find accessible transport, if you need to access supports, this becomes even more difficult. Access as well is actually quite difficult in the sense that disabled people struggle to access terminations of or access healthcare in all sorts of settings. But because of physical infrastructure of healthcare settings, because of kind of ideas or preconceptions about their disability or bias that their healthcare practitioner has, these are all sort of magnified within the reproductive health space. One of the things that became quite clear during the project was like the power that locally available services would have if someone was able to, without fear, go in and be cared for by someone who understood their access needs and be able to like truly meet their needs and understand them. But also participants in the oral histories expressed like fear that they would really like to be able to access this within their own, but they wouldn't know what their GP's feelings on this would be. Their GP could be a conscientious objector, even just would that even possibly damage their relationship with their healthcare provider, how that would play out. And this was in the hypotheticals in terms of thinking about what would happen if I were to get pregnant. Because of this local provision of abortion, which again has the potential to be really strong, we also see a significant reports of people traveling even after the termination of pregnancy acts has been through. This is partly people traveling internally within the country, right? People who are in areas where they are not able to access it, but also people who fall out of these narrow grounds that we discussed earlier, still traveling to the UK. There's a lot of abortion is free now, but we never really think about the cost of disability and the cost of travel within that, and that it's not necessarily free or easily financially accessible for all people. Support is also something that's, oh dear, support is also something that's become really clear as an issue. But within that, some fear about how people may be blocked from accessing their normal supports. Throughout the project, we kind of heard reports of people, supporters or services maybe having objections to someone accessing fertility treatment, people expressing opinions on whether or not someone should be having sex, so on and so forth. So when it comes to abortion, where conscientious objection is often discussed as a right, even though this is constructed in law as something which is incredibly narrow, we could see this being expanded out much beyond, and people feeling that they have a right to conscientiously object even where they're not actually providing a termination of pregnancy service. Okay, I'm going to just skip through a couple of slides there because I am conscious that I'm running out of time. The presumption of capacity and choice. We are very anxious, and I think Susie reflected this earlier, about how our new capacity legislation may be weaponized in terms of failing to fully respect the will and preferences of someone as to whether or not they carry on a pregnancy. We could see, particularly through reading through the KIs, a lot of focus on the non-capacitous person or various other terms that possibly shouldn't be used at all, but very little focus on supporting someone to make a decision on what it means to fully respect someone's will and preference and to really embrace some of the principles of the new law rather than using it. We also saw quite a lot about informal coercion, and I think particularly if we track the law in the UK, we can see a lot of this stuff doesn't really end up in court, that various coercive practices can kind of come in early. And with one of the reports, and this can happen both in terms of, you know, facilitating someone to access an abortion or blocking them. And I think respecting someone in terms of their right to make a decision includes respecting it once it's made. And we saw, particularly within the KIs, reports of someone saying again and again that professionals have decided what was a good outcome for a person, and then using and then constantly suggesting abortion when the person had made their own mind up, and that this was very much infantilization and this was very much seen. So even though we also have concerns around how the New Capacity Act will operate, actual practice and day-to-day practice can have a much more significant impact. I'm going to, if I have not covered everything there, if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer, but I'm so excited to hear from them and Agnieszka that I'm going to just leave it at that and not speak over my time.
Thanks, Maria, that was absolutely excellent. I forgot to say that somehow Maria and I have dressed to match the tablecloth, which is a kind of, I'm going to say, kind of dusky pink. And so Maria was obliged to do this in order to keep the branding of the University of Galway solid. But I have absolutely no excuse. And I've just noticed that NEMS Cane is also on a similar kind of spectrum. So not every panel made this effort, is what I'm going to say. NEM is a disabled abortion rights activist, and they're going to be reflecting on the Irish experience of abortion access and picking up, I suppose, on many of the themes that Maria has introduced. So take it away, and I will just direct your attention to the fact that there's a timekeeper in front, but I will also be
much appreciated.
Making gestures as agreed. Okay.
I have no internal block whatsoever. You just notice that there's like 3 people trying to keep me on time. I just want to kind of mention a couple of things at the front, just to kind of frame what I'm going to say. I don't have personal lived experience of accessing abortion in Ireland. I'm not going to be speaking from lived experience, but I am going to try to kind of highlight and put in perspective just some of the ways that the interaction of the law and the systems really undermine and restrict disabled people's options and choices and access to the full range of reproductive care. And also kind of put it in that framework of us being a community that has a very complicated relationship and history with this issue. But it does fall into, no matter what a person's individual choice is, whether it's in continuing a pregnancy or terminating a pregnancy, our right to choose and the respect and support we get in making that choice is not guaranteed. And it adds to the stress and pressure that people can experience, particularly in cases of unplanned pregnancy. Sorry, Maria has actually highlighted a lot of the things I was going to speak about and has given a great introduction to the legislation, so I don't have to do that. I just want to mention as well that the 12 weeks limit for abortion on request refers to 12 weeks since the last menstrual period, which in practice for most people means 10 weeks pregnant. So just to kind of, again, have that conception of how short a time we're actually talking about to access services and get the support you need. sorry, I'm skipping past where the stuff about the law. I will not bore you with it again. So although there are a lot of concerns for around post-week provision, the grounds for getting, post-12-week provision to access abortion after those 12 weeks, I'm going to mainly focus on the pre-12 weeks. And again, just to bear in mind that these access barriers will also apply to post-12 weeks, as well as additional concerns. And although I'll be highlighting examples, given the diversity of our community, I cannot capture everyone's unique experience. It just highlights how at every turn we hit barriers and are made invisible and not supported by the system. I also, there's a lot of keep in mind, so disabled people are part of every marginalized community and face the challenges they face. And we're also much more likely to experience some of the factors that are already known to severely restrict access to abortion, such as experience of family and interpersonal violence, coercive control, social isolation, poverty, and lack of access to transport. And we're also much more likely to have our decision-making competence called into question. Due to the pervasive desexualization of disabled people that so many people today have spoken so powerfully about, we're much more likely to get sex education, and as Bears, sorry, I'm bad with names, highlighted. Very frequently, disabled people do not have their contraceptive options discussed with them, or their options around unplanned pregnancy. And this in conjunction with a lot of the disability specific factors that can make it difficult to identify pregnancy, such as irregular menstruation or interoception issues, means that we're statistically much more likely to discover we're pregnant further along in the pregnancy and have less time to work with. And the stigma around abortion, like Susie was highlighting, the stigma around LGBTQ plus identities can make it impossible or unsafe to get support from family members, caregivers, and even personal assistants. So the abortion before 12 weeks is led by GPs and sexual health clinics, and there's additional support and provision in hospitals. A national study by the National Women's Council found that only 1 in 10 GPs and just under half of the hospitals in Ireland provide abortion care as of 2021. And this lack of provision means that most disabled people are not able to access care with their own GP. Someone who is familiar with their potentially complex medical history and their needs. And that's the CDLP report highlighted how even like in this context, disabled people are offered far less choice and are unlikely to have a choice in what methods of abortion care they get, because they're much more likely to be referred to hospital because a new GP doesn't know the risk factors and their history. And having to travel to hospital obviously just completely snowballs those additional costs, that extra travel, isolates people from their support systems, and causes additional delays, because even if you're referred to hospital for pre-12-week care, there is no flexibility. It doesn't matter why you can't get care under 12 weeks. If you can't get it in that time frame, you can't get it, even if the delay was caused by the system. And to get information on how to get an abortion in Ireland, you need to contact a service called My Options. And while this has been made much more accessible in some ways since it was launched, it still doesn't provide information in accessible formats. There's no easy to read, there's no ISL interpretation or video formats. They have introduced some access for deaf, hard of hearing, and people with speech impairment to the helpline, but they're all provided through external services, so you have to book an appointment and have more delays. There is a web chat feature, but it appears that although users can get general information, they can't actually get information about what GPs or services they can use, and have to phone the helpline anyway. So not that accessible. And it also, another thing to keep in mind with all of this is when people can't access something and need to seek support, not only is it delays, but it is compromising their right to privacy and possibly their safety, because abortion is still so stigmatized. And as also highlighted by Mairéad and others, that means that if they seek support from someone who isn't safe, they may have to live with that person, and the consequences could be very, very dangerous. Once people have been given GPs, My Options does not give information about the accessibility of GPs. And most GPs and primary care services and hospitals, to be honest, are not fully accessible to all people. So trying to get that access and ring around and go back to the helpline can just already put people beyond 12 weeks before they've even gotten an appointment. Once they find a GP, the law requires there to be at least 3 days, 2 appointments, and there has to be at least 3 days between the 2 appointments. There is no medical basis for this whatsoever. It just creates more barriers and delays and is ideologically driven. The planning to attend these 2 appointments, the planning and organising for most disabled people is huge. If someone needs a support person, an ISL translator, a personal assistant, they'll have to arrange all of those schedules to match up with both appointments. A lot of neurodivergent people who can be up to 10 times more likely to experience unplanned pregnancy, have executive function issues, and that is not something there are support services for in Ireland. Executive functioning is literally the ability to plan and carry out steps. So that's kind of important. There's also a pervasive misunderstanding of the role of family members in making medical decisions for disabled people across all sorts of services and health, including healthcare services in Ireland, and lack of regulation of rogue pregnancy clinics and misinformation compromises disabled people's right to accessible information, particularly for those with intellectual disability, some cognitive impairments, and some autistic people. We all know that transport in Ireland for disabled people is completely lacking and can be extremely expensive. 45% of disabled people struggle to access public transport. And sorry, I'm running out of time. A lot of people with fluctuating impairment also find it difficult to predict when they'll be able to travel or to physically travel twice in a week. There are so many additional barriers for those in congregated or institutional settings. Again, around organisation and privacy and so many other factors. And some people literally will not be able to travel for abortion. Sorry, yes, I just wanted to just wrap up by just saying that there are so many other concerns and questions, and that's why it's so amazing just to have the people here today and everyone involved in the Reproductive Justice Project looking at these, highlighting these, and ensuring that all of us have equal access to all our choices.
Thanks, Million. It's such a huge number of interlocking issues to get through. So abolish linear time so we can discuss them all. So the final speaker with a kind of an international perspective on the radical transformation and yet continuing inadequacy of our abortion law is Agnieszka Krol, who is an academic and activist based in Poland, working, I think, currently with CREA, and take it away.
Thank you so much, and thank you for everyone who organized this very important conference. And what I'm going to be speaking about, I think, will resonate very much with what Maria and them has been talking about. Yes, I'm working at CREA, which is a feminist human rights organization. We work very closely with organizations and communities of women and non-binary and trans persons with disabilities, also in the global south countries. So I'm gonna build on this experience, but also I'm gonna zoom in on my experiences as I'm being based in Poland. And I've conducted my PhD research on reproductive justice and disability and experiences of women with disabilities in Poland, so Central Eastern Europe. And the first point I really want to make, and I think it really was strongly already said, but that what we I think observe in the recent years is really this intensified articulation around abortion laws, especially by women with disabilities, that is really centering decision making, whatever this decision is, as well as independent living tools and systems as enabling environment for those decisions. And I think it's very important to recognize this moment. And it also aligns with, we can see that, of course, in many countries that have been debating abortion laws and regulations in recent years. And we could observe that in countries like, of course, Ireland, Argentina, Brazil, Poland, to a certain extent in Kenya and India also. And this goes in line also with the joint statement by the CEDAW and CRPD committees on the reproductive rights of women with disabilities that recommended the decriminalization of abortion by the states. And maybe to zoom in now on and build on what you've been sharing about the experience of Ireland, to zoom in a little bit to the experience of Poland, I think that this change, like this intensification of articulation around abortion rights has also been visible in the country I'm living in. And 7 years back, when the first abortion strikes in Poland happened, when we've been joining the strikes as a feminist disability rights organization that was supporting the protests, but also challenging the ableism within the organized protests, we were being kind of perceived as an impossible subject somewhat. I think in the latest protest of 2020, this has really changed, and basically also due to a lot of action taken by disability rights activists. So at that time, for example, one of the Polish activists, Katarzyna Bieżanowska, organized an action called Strike with Audio Description. And we also observed a lot of stories of women with disabilities talking about reproductive rights. However, I'm being very optimistic because, of course, in the mainstream media, we wouldn't see this much of kind of what we've seen in the social movement. We wouldn't be reported that much in the mainstream media. So basically what has changed in Poland, and I guess I wish we would be, despite all of the barriers described, I wish we would be, after also some more liberalized approach to abortion. But in Poland, in fact, the abortion law got restricted in 2020, and its consequences are that basically it's very, very difficult to access any state-provided abortion. But what we also have observed is that there is much more networks and information in public space, basically provided by activists on how to access travel abroad for abortion or how to access the pills. And this is the landscape that women with disabilities navigate in Poland nowadays. So I won't repeat maybe what has been said about the labor of access, but of course it will again be here very relevant when it comes both to traveling abroad as well as accessing the pills themselves and self-managing abortion. But I wanted to draw our attention also to the recent results of the research that has been also conducted on the access to abortion by women with disabilities by Katarzyna Bieżanowska and her colleagues, who really also problematized that in Poland, what is criminalized, in fact, is the support, not when the person is doing abortion themselves or herself, but the support. So this puts women with disabilities who would need support in a very particular position also. And we are just now observing the first trials for support in abortion of Justyna Wydrzyńska, one of the abortion activists. And this is like a very important trial that is now going on and happening in Poland. Of course, there are also questions around legal capacity, around guardianship, and around institutionalization and the situation of women with disabilities disabilities and persons with disabilities under these regimes. There is also a question around the working in silos and the complex history between the disability rights and women's rights movement, resulting in not always that women with disabilities would have access to the networks and information provided. And what we've been also dealing recently with is also the question around the so-called health grounds for abortion. So the risk of deterioration of health or the risk of life of a pregnant person. And this also, I think we really lack knowledge on what does it really mean for persons with disabilities who want to access this legal framework of abortion, because this is, of course, navigating through a very, very hostile environment, but also navigating a medical environment that for many people would be connected with misunderstanding of or having like past medical traumas. And maybe the last point I want to make before I conclude is that again, when we are in this maybe international perspective, when we are talking about abortion and disability, what hasn't changed is again still this paradox of position of women with disabilities due to what we call in sociology reproductive stratification, that in fact being very often women with disabilities still will be suggested an abortion only for ableist reasons. And this, I think, is very, very important to understand by all of the sexual and reproductive health rights actors, especially coming from women's rights spaces, not only to kind of focus and limit our actions on the access to abortion, which, as we know, is super key and important and necessary, but really to frame our actions around what we learned from the Black feminist movement around the reproductive justice in a way to understand like how all the complexities around what we heard today around ableist systems of coerced and forced treatments, or also support in decision making, how they are very much important for us, like that they are very much the priorities of persons with disabilities. So I really wanted to also congratulate the team that did this research and also framing it as a very important matter, but also like putting the focus on all of the aspects of reproductive justice, which I think is really important in all our movements. So thank you.
So thank you to everybody for such rich and interesting contributions. I think it's my job now to open it up to the floor. If anybody has any questions. Yes, lady in front.
Hi, excellent presentations by all. Could I ask I'm just opening it up to all of the panel. In terms of I suppose one of the areas that the anti-abortion activists would have used during the repeal campaign was the eradication of people with disabilities if we brought abortion into Ireland, because of and now. So I'm just wondering, in terms of that rhetoric, how is that impacted, or has it impacted, or did you find that it impacted women with disabilities who were seeking to have terminations? Did that I suppose that argument that the anti-abortion activists were using maybe have an impact on women's decisions in terms of, well, here am I, a woman with a disability seeking a termination, possibly on the grounds of the child having a disability and the guilt that goes with that.
So part of the project was maybe slightly inspired by the focus on that, to really focus on pregnant people, and it definitely came up through it. A couple of the oral histories that people really felt the campaign loomed large, and particularly for one that's really I've read 15 times and will read 15 more. But I'm actually going to pass this over to Nem, because just from my own personal, it's really difficult not to answer that question as an activist. And I think it was possibly better answered that way. So Nem, if you wouldn't mind answering it.
Yeah, I'll answer as best I can, or just kind of like throw out some thoughts. And it's also because it had such an impact in many ways, the personal, the political and framing. So that rhetoric, which didn't engage with disabled people at all, influenced the very restrictive, criminalized legal framework we have, which ironically has led to tensions between disability justice advocates and reproductive rights advocates, because the laws we have are overly restricted and there's still so many people who have a fatal fetal abnormality. So that is where, in the best medical opinions, if it does result in live birth, it will not survive. The baby wouldn't survive for very long. But because that was pushed and restricted for that argument, it means that people who need it for that reason can't get it. So now there are calls to introduce for non-fatal fetal abnormality, which is disability. So it's actually led to us having to face off actual devaluation of our rights sanctioned by legislation, so which, you know, it caused lots of issues. And then if I could kind of speak from personal perspective, so 20%, more than 20% of the respondents to the abortion rights survey on experience of the services were disabled, and 45% of those reported barriers. So disabled people are accessing abortion services. It's just with this whole argument has made it very difficult for them to talk about it. I'm a non-binary person, and I have never in my life ever wanted to be pregnant or have children. And there's all sorts of reasons and just no reasons for that. And if I was pregnant, just the act of being pregnancy would cause me to experience significant gender dysphoria and psychological distress. But because of this conversation around disability and abortion, and also because it is very true that there is prenatal screening, that there are huge international projects looking to genetically identify what causes people like me and stop it happening, that where I in that position, even though I know my own mind, I know what I want, I know what's best for my life, I would still have a huge amount of conflict. I'm a reproductive rights advocate. I'm someone who has always known what I would want if I experienced pregnancy, and I would still, because of these arguments, have additional stress and psychological ramifications that I wouldn't have if we had been included and embedded in the conversation and not weaponized for political point scoring. I don't know if that answers, but I just want to give some kind of ideas to kick around.
Thank you. Marion Dyer, Start Doctors, providing GPs. First of all, thank you to everybody so far, because there's so much for us professionals and medics to learn. And I'm really grateful for everything I'm hearing. Just one or two very brief points. Just following on from what you were saying there, Nem. At the moment, you cannot legally access an abortion on the grounds that the fetus will have a disability. I also think it's really healthy and helpful to say, as an abortion activist, that there are conflicts and there are uncertainties, and life has grey areas. And I just think within the pro-choice movement, it's really helpful to be able to say that. There is a test called the panorama test, which can be performed usually between 11 and 13 weeks, which can pick up a range of disabilities. But because you can't really get a reliable result until between 11 and 13 weeks, and our cutoff for on request is 12 weeks with a 3-day wait, to the best of my knowledge, we don't have pregnant people getting abortions on the grounds of a risk of disability in Ireland. What happens is you have people who will get the test done in Ireland, and depending on the result and perhaps a follow-up amniocentesis test after that, they will then travel, and some do make that decision. You mentioned the fatal fetal abnormality grant. The basis of that is, as a doctor, I have to say on a legal document that I predict in good faith that a baby, if delivered, will die within 28 days, not within 29 days or 30 days, 28. What that means is that there are realistically 2 conditions regarding fetal anomalies that obstetricians in Ireland will perform and feel that they're not going to be criminalised. One is anencephaly, so the incomplete development of a brain and a skull, and the other is where no kidneys are developing in the fetus. Both conditions basically incompatible with life. So there are many people with what we would define as fatal fetal abnormalities, but a baby might live for 2 months or 6 weeks, and the people who are still traveling comprise many in that group. The very group that an awful lot of voters who have been polled said they voted yes to help. These are not judgments, they're just some points of information. The final thing, I just wanted to say something hopeful and positive, and it's this. We did manage to get a benefit from COVID in that prior to COVID, the woman was required to attend in person to the GP on 2 occasions, at least 3 days apart. And she was required to swallow the pills in front of the doctor, which is pretty infantilizing. Because of COVID, we are now allowed to remotely provide abortion health care so that all of the visits can be done remotely. And then you can either collect or you can nominate a person to collect the medication for you. So, and this newer system is being maintained. It's not going to be cut off because the pandemic is over. So I suppose that's just one little bright spot on the horizon. I just thought it might be nice to say something that's positive. And thank you.
A couple of things. One, I do think now was very clear that this wasn't actually the law right now, although the law right now has more wiggle room than I think that was allowed for there. It was actually about the calls to fix the law effectively being something that now go to devalue disabled lives and now bring us to an entirely different place, which never actually linked with the aims of what people voted for in the referendum, as was raised by Louise just earlier on. A couple of things on that as well. FFA could be interpreted much more broadly. The list could be so much more longer. It was longer. We saw some civil suits. It got shorter. We do know that it's being interpreted very conservatively right now. That is a significant issue. I think the residual criminalisation of medical professionals plays into that in an exceptionally large way, but that goes beyond the FFA ground, right? Prior to 12 weeks, there are several grounds on which you can access termination of pregnancy. One of those is health, and I didn't get to discuss that in detail during this, but that is also something that we haven't seen expand massively post 12 weeks since the introduction of the new act compared to the Protection of Life During Pregnancy Act, which means that all grounds, not just FFA, are being interpreted in a manner that is conservative, and this particularly disadvantages disabled people. Because my estimation of my own disabled body mind and NEM's estimation of their own disabled body mind is the best determination of health. And we don't have room for that in the current system. And we would be very lucky to get a professional that would, or to meet a doctor who would really take that into account when making a health estimation. The issue isn't with one ground, it's with all grounds. The fact is, we have moved to this idea that we want abortion only for the good, the deserving, the electable abortions, right? That is actually what we're looking for. And because of that, we have this system where it's not a right to termination, but this like permission for when it's okay. And one of the mistakes that I do feel happens and that really disadvantages disabled people is that we've decided that we're going to continue with that same paradigm rather than looking and saying, actually, 66% of people who in this country voted for at least some unrequested abortion were more okay with it than like people had ever believed. And it's time we started looking at an actual right and actually looking at reproductive justice. So I'm gonna, Nem, do you want to jump in on any of that?
Sorry, just to sound a little bit. Yeah, I obviously wasn't clear enough. What I was trying to convey was, I like fully aware of all that, was that because we are not treating abortion as healthcare, because we are criminalizing it and treating doctors potentially as criminals, they cannot practice medicine to their best, in their, best of their ability, in the best interest of their patients. And that is what is causing the conflict between reproductive rights and disability rights. There doesn't need to be one. It's because we will not treat healthcare as healthcare.
So Eleanor has been begging me with her eyes to put a bullet in the ADHD revolution of the panel here.
Can I just say I put this panel together and you did not object?
You knew what was going to happen.
Time is ableist.
Time is ableist. Time's an ableist construct. But is it just send everyone to lunch now, Eleanor, or go eat, come back?